Okay, I believe it is recording. All right, so within Blackboard, just as a reminder, there's under paper resources, one of the most important resources is a template. So I have basically formatted the paper for you, and I've kind of written out what needs to go in each section. Part of this is because I want you to use sort of APA. I'm not going to really hold your feet to the fire on it, but I do want you to get pretty close to APA style. And so up here, the way APA, basically what you need to know about APA style is that you make a title for your paper right here. Please come up with your own title rather than just copying and pasting your article title. I am not grading you based on how good your title is. Just come up with something, kind of let me know what the topic is. And then for APA, we double click up in the header and you put in sort of a shortened version of your title in all caps on the first page. Then you fill in your name and Caldwell University stays there. You don't need to put my name, you don't need to put the date or the class. For this paper, all you need is the title and your name. So I'm going to scroll down. Now on the second page, you have to change the header again because the header looks a little different on the two different versions. Again, I've given you a template, so it should be fairly easy to fill it in, but I am going to look for you to have done this. So the same short title that you did on the first page, you'll put there, and then at the very top of your page here, you'll put the full title, bless you, that you used in your paper. Make sense? It's really just kind of filling in the blanks for that part. And I'm just going to walk you section through section what needs to go here in your paper. So the first one, you want to have just kind of an introductory paragraph. You want to have some sort of thesis statement, sort of the main point you want me to get from your paper. Sort of like if you only had one sentence to tell me something, what would you tell me? And the introduction, it comes first. People feel like they should write it first. Honestly, I would say let this be one of the last things you write because you want to make sure it makes sense with your whole paper. Sometimes you start out planning to say one thing and then it changes over time. Often that's how writing goes. And so I find it easiest to write the introduction at the end so you make sure it still makes sense. You do want to include a very brief summary of the article here. You can take part of what you wrote for your article summary if you want, but you're going to not include a whole paragraph, just a line or two, basically saying what was studied. So the introduction comes as part of layout and form. So getting those things, filling in your title and the name and keeping the formatting correctly and doing an introduction is part of this 10% from layout and form. And then writing style is also part of having a clear introduction and thesis statement. That's worth 10% of your paper. So as I go through here, I know I use a rubric. It's a standard rubric that we use for all the Gen Psych I classes, but it's kind of vague. So I've tried here to tell you what I'm really looking for and let you know how many points everything is worth. Honestly, if you're in a rush, if you know you don't have a ton of time to dedicate to it, you can use this as a guide to say, if I only have an hour to work on this paper today, where should I do my work? So for this, I've really just kind of broken it down using headings. It's the easiest way for me as a reader, and it's pretty easy for you as a writer too. So first, independent and dependent variables. These are the different pieces that they're measuring as part of the study. So for example, if I were doing a study on whether men or women get drunk faster based on the amount of alcohol, if they're drinking the same amount of alcohol, who gets drunk faster? What are my variables?
Men, women, alcohol, time.
Okay, so one variable is gender, men versus women, and then another variable is alcohol and time. How much alcohol or how long can I drink before I get drunk? And for this, one thing I want you to do is to make sure you're italicizing the variables. That makes it much easier for me to pick it out. Sometimes it kind of feels ambiguous. I'm not sure what you meant to say. So when you italicize it, you know that I know what you're trying to say. I really encourage you to always make it easy for me to give you points. So one is, what was the independent or predictor variable? The one And when you're trying to say the independent or the predictor variable, they mean the same thing. It's sometimes easiest to say which one came first, because if you're predicting based on that variable, it has to come first. So in our study of gender and alcohol use, which one would come first? Gender, because I walk into the room male or female already. And so gender has to be my predictor variable. It sometimes is what they manipulated. So like if I am doing a study to see whether, sticking with alcohol, whether alcohol changes your driving ability. In this case, I'm manipulating how much alcohol you're getting. Sometimes things like gender, I can't really assign you to be male or female once you walk in the room, but it's either the one that comes first, the one that you're sort of stuck with, or the thing that you're being grouped into different groups or assigned an amount. If you have trouble figuring out which is which in your study, sometimes they'll say it somewhere in the article, but that's something I can usually tell you pretty quickly, not usually over email, but if you just stop by my office or ask me after class or during a break, I can usually, if you just describe your study, I can tell you which is which. Then the other variable is the dependent or outcome variable. And there may be more than one of either of these, but the dependent or outcome variable is the one that came later or was influenced by that independent or predictor variable. So in the original study I talked about with gender and alcohol, what is the outcome variable? So I do give you alcohol, but the actual outcome that I'm measuring is how drunk you are. So I'm giving everyone the same amount of alcohol. Some of you are men, some of you are women, and then I see how quickly you become intoxicated. And so the outcome variable that I'm measuring is level of drunkenness. What about if I'm doing one on alcohol and driving ability? And I'm giving some of you lots of alcohol, some of you little alcohol, and then measuring how well you can drive. What's the predictor variable there? Which one comes first? What? Yep, the amount of alcohol I'm giving you comes first, and it's the one that I'm manipulating. I'm giving half of you a lot, half of you a little. So what would be the outcome variable in that study? Driving ability, because that's what I'm studying later, and that's what I think is going to be influenced by the independent or predictor variable. So again, this is something I do want you to name which is which. I'm happy to help you with it. I usually don't give paper help over email. Sometimes if it's really specific, I will. But it's something, a lot of these small questions I can easily do during sort of before and after class. And in each time I tell you about how long the section should be. That's a little flexible, but basically if you spend all your time on the first couple spaces, some of the later ones are worth a lot more points and you don't have much space left. So it's to help you kind of budget your space. I know students usually approach things like, how am I going to write that many pages? But with this paper, really, there's so many specific things you need to address. Don't worry about trying to fluff. Very few people find that they need to add some fluff later on. Usually if you're putting enough in, and sometimes I just kind of do these nonsensical pasting, just so you can see when you look at this, the headings fall about where they should fall for your paper. The next one is the summary of background literature. This is usually the first section in your article. Sometimes it says literature review or background. Sometimes there's no heading and it just jumps into it. But it's sort of like, what information did they have before? One thing to kind of keep in mind when you are doing like real scholarly works, when you're writing things to publish yourself, you want to give credit to each article. So if I see that this article I'm reading cites someone else, I need to go look at that other article if I want to use that author's work, because I need to cite that article as an expert. In this case, it's okay to kind of ignore, for this paper, it's okay to ignore the other citations that you see. I really am just interested in you sort of summarizing the information. This is kind of like, what information did they base their study on? Usually we start sort of we start small and then we build. Each person contributes to the research, and so you want to see what are they building on. And this section will be about half a page to 2/3 because there's a lot of, you need to explain to me the most important points to understand why they did the study. So the background literature, a lot of you mentioned a little bit of in your summary. You also should have mentioned something about methodology. There were a few people that I said, make sure that you're more specific about the methodology when you write your actual paper. And here I specify, so when you look at your articles, you'll see things like, most of them have a subheading that says participants. They might have another one that says materials and procedures, or some words kind of like that. So they're telling you who they're measuring, what they're using to measure, whether it's a paper and pencil survey or whether they're measuring blood pressure, if they have a driving simulator, whatever it would be, and then how it's being measured, kind of what happens when the participant shows up at the lab. You want to look at things like, who are the participants? You want to see age, sex, racial and ethnic background, and anything else that's important. Like if I'm doing a study of marriage quality or relationship quality, I want to know, am I including, so let's say it's relationship quality, I want to know, who am I measuring? Am I measuring married people? Are they newly married? Have they been married a long time? Is it their first marriage? I want to know, do I have all heterosexual individuals? Because it may work to, the principles may or may not be the same for individuals who are homosexual. And so we want to pay attention to, is this study really measuring everybody, or is it just measuring one small sample? You might remember from the TED Talk with Zimbardo, he said Milgram at first used only men. Later, they repeated the study with women because it's important to see if women act differently in that situation. This can be just 1 or 2 sentences, kind of briefly mention the tests and measures that they use and the procedures that they use. This is one place where students often get a little confused. So again, I'm very, very available to help you understand what's going on, or if you feel stuck in how to put it into your own words. That's something that I can certainly help with. And so usually everyone should have a section that says methods or methodology that points you to where this information is. And so you're going to summarize the main points. Then you're going to summarize the results and discussion. Students often feel overwhelmed by the results section in particular. My sort of hint for Gen Psych I students is that the discussion section, it's the last section, and usually the first paragraph of that section summarizes all the important findings. So usually if you kind of look through the results section briefly and then look at that discussion section, that first paragraph usually summarizes the main points. So try reading through it at least once, try looking at the graphs, but know that there's usually other places where they summarize it in a way that's a little easier to understand. And the discussion section is where the authors interpret the findings. So they tell you what it means, what they found. They try to put it into the context of the literature that's already existing. So they try to explain it. And again, this one may be tough to put in your own words. You have me, you also have the writing center. Often the librarians are willing to help with things like, how do I understand this research? That's one of the roles of librarians, is to help you access and understand information. So if you're really struggling to put things in your own words, there's a good resource for that. Also, I want to warn you to be careful how much you quote. I'll check in a moment, because I know from my other class I have specific places I specify how much you're allowed to quote. This one I need to check to see if I have told you exactly how much you're allowed to quote. But if you're quoting a lot, if it feels like it's mostly coming from the source, even if you're putting it into your own words, you're going to lose points, because this paper, or I'm sorry, even if you're correctly attributing it, but you're quoting them instead of putting it in your own words, you'll lose points, because I don't know, you're not doing the work by just cutting and pasting. And if you directly copy without giving credit, it'll be reported as plagiarism, and you'll lose points for the paper. Critique. So up to now, you've been summarizing the article. This is all summary. This is kind of your expanding and getting more specific from the paragraph that you turned in to me. The next 2 sections of the paper our critique. This is the part that often gets harder for students, and this is the part that we're going to spend a little bit of time working on today. It's also the part where you get the most points. Your critique is worth 20%. So the other sections have all been worth 10% each. Your critique is worth 20%. I don't know where I say that in here, but it is. And your personal reaction and evaluation is also worth 20%. So these are the two sections that you really want to focus on. And I find that students often sort of have run out of room, time, energy, whatever, and they short these sections, which is not helpful for your grade. It's not very strategic. And so critique is also one of the things that students tend to not really be familiar. You guys have often written lots of papers where you have to summarize information, so you know how to do that. But critique, that's part of what I think you learn to do in college. And so a lot of students aren't really sure. It's just intimidating because you have this article that's finished, that's done by people, usually with people with PhDs. It's very technical language that's difficult to understand. And so students often feel like they aren't really qualified or ready to critique that. What I'm going to tell you is every study ever created under the sun has limitations and has things you can critique. Good studies still have limitations. Just like the Milgram study. The first one didn't talk about women. They didn't use any women. I doubt that they used any men of color. They were trying to get different classes, but a lot of research leaves out working class individuals. A lot of relationship research leaves out LGBT individuals. And so you can often find a population, you can sort of critique who's not being measured here. So we can look at things like, was the sample biased? Was it not diverse enough? Also, much of the research that we talk about gets done either in the US, the UK, or Australia. We're very biased toward English-speaking industrialized countries. And so, but then we talk about things as if they're universal. That's not okay to do. We have to keep in mind that when our data is coming from all US samples, we need to see if maybe part of it is cultural. Also, were there other variables, either things that were measured or were left out, that could have caused the findings? Those are called confounding variables. So when we talk about participants, one of the things is, for men versus women, some of the finding could be based on gender. And so it could be something different where men and women would react differently. And so when you only measure one gender, you lose a lot of the findings. So when you're critiquing, you're trying to figure out what did they not do, because it's impossible for any one study to do everything. Now, each study should have a section called limitations near the end. This is like your cheat sheet for this section, because they will tell you some of the things that they did not do well. And so you can take those things, put them in your own words, and present them. But I'm also going to be looking for you to have at least one critique that's your own. I want you to make at least one point that's not made within the article. And so we'll talk about how to do that in a little bit. And that's another thing. You can come to office hours. That one takes a little longer, so you can try just kind of bringing it to class and asking me during a break or after class. But that one may take a little bit more, like 10 to 15 minutes to really look through. But I'm more than willing to help. So again, this section is 20% of your grade. It should be longer than the other sections. It should have a few different paragraphs. And also remember the things we talked about at the beginning of the semester. You want to have this sort of curiosity, skepticism, and humility. So you want to ask questions. You want to ask to see data before you believe things. But you also want to be willing to accept the data if it says something that surprises you. And also, in this section, you really want to focus on scientific thinking. So there's the next section you get to give more of your own opinion, but here you're really focused on what scientifically can be critiqued. Any questions so far? Okay. The next section is personal reaction and evaluation. This is 20%, and as long as you put some effort and thought into it, this should be pretty easy points to get. I'm always a little disappointed when I have to mark off points on this section because it's really accessible. This is where you tell me, what did you think about the article? In this place, so for the rest of the writing, it should be sort of scientific, it should be third person, but in this part, you're allowed to be first person. You're allowed to say I, me, mine, our. You should still write it sort of carefully, no contractions, using good grammar. Sort of like something you might get published in the school newspaper, like an editorial. And so here you can really tell me what you really think of it. Was it what you thought it would be? What surprised you from the findings? What will you remember from the study? Because the main finding might not be the piece that sticks with you. There might be some detail, even from the background literature, that is really what kind of sticks with you as you go. You can also talk about how it fits with your own experience. Usually we choose something because it's meaningful for us. I find a lot of athletes choose things that have to do with sports. I study grief, and that's partly because I've had grief affect me in my life. Usually we're drawn to things because they fit for us somehow, either for us individually or for someone we know and care about. And so usually you have some experiences to bring to the table. Did the data fit with what you thought, with these consistencies? Does it help explain what you've seen in your life? And was there something, did they make a conclusion that you really disagree with based on your own experiences and what you've observed? And this isn't a place where you have to, disclose a ton to me about your life, but you can just say, I've seen people respond to this differently. And so this doesn't really seem to capture their opinion. Or to say, this really actually describes well what I've seen happen. If there is something that you really didn't agree with, tell me why you didn't agree. Why was the data insufficient to convince you? Was it because they didn't measure well? Was it because they didn't ask the right people or ask the questions in the right way? Or is there something, what would it take to convince you if this were real? Because again, we want to be skeptical, but we also want to be humble. We want to say, I would be, there is some level of data that could convince me that the sky is red. Like there is a point that I would agree the sky is red. I just would need a lot of data to convince me of that. And again, I'm giving you a lot of examples of things you could talk about, but I don't want you to just try to match exactly what I've said. I'm giving you lots of examples, and I want to see you really make it your own. And again, this section can be one of the longer ones because it's longer. Your references, you'll only have one reference for this, so you'll just sort of delete these, and this is kind of just examples of APA citation style. I am going to grade based on whether you do your APA citation correctly. It's just not going to, it's going to be worth some points, but not a ton, maybe 1 or 2, maybe 3% of your total grade. So you want to do it, you want to run it by me. Some of you, I was able to give you feedback in the first section, but you can always come to office hours or bring something, especially if you bring it hard copy to me during class. I can zip through it real quick with a pen and let you know if it's right or not. The Writing Center and especially the librarians are really great for this also. And that's the end of your paper. With the title page, so it's 3 to 4 pages in the middle, but with the title page and the reference page at the end, it'll be 5 to 6 pages final. And it's important to know there's penalties for going too short, but there's also penalties for going over. I'm really looking for you to figure out how to fit it within the guidelines. Any questions at this point? Yes?
So can we just use the same headline, headers for each section?
So the same headers for each section, you sure can. Let me show you how this works.
I meant the header, I forgot what you call it. Like the, bold.
Oh, the headings within the sections? Yes, please, actually, please do. Please just leave those in because that matches up exactly with my grading rubric. And so I know exactly what's supposed to be there. Because one of the things I look for is just, is the section there? So you don't, if you wanted to, you could add subheadings. And subheadings just go in, you hit enter, and you make sure that it's flush left. And you just write your subheading with capitalized case. So you just kind of capitalize all the important words if you want a subheading. But you don't need to. You can just leave all those headings in there. I am not looking for creativity in that place. Any other questions right now? Okay. So again, the critique is what I find students struggle the most with. Does anyone have an idea of a critique for their study? All right. Is anyone willing to offer their study as something we can look for a critique for, which means you get free critique to use in your paper? So you just have to briefly tell me what your study's about, and we'll figure out some critiques. Free help. Yes.
Can I just give an example of
Okay.
because I don't think it's exactly what I want to talk about, but could you?
So first, just really briefly, what was your study looking at?
Wait, can I actually call into this because I don't think this is the right.
Oh, you don't have the right one with you.
I don't have the right one.
Okay. Yeah.
My study is about stress, sex, and satisfaction in marriage.
Okay.
How does stress and sex itself affect the satisfaction in marriage? So, like, the factors that I looked at in the study are, like, what kind of stress is being caused? Is it being caused, like, within the relationship or, like, external pressures, like, how, like, jobs and stuff like that, or, like, sex, and then, like, would it be, like, sexual dysfunction and, like, like if you're happy with the sex, like, are you happy with your partner? Are you happy with your marriage? Like, if there are factors in your sex life that you don't like, how does that affect your partner? Like, how does sex and stress, like, play? Like, so yeah, that's what I was
Yeah.
thinking about. So it looks at, like, a bunch of married couples, and just surveys.
Yeah. So let me summarize that real quick for the video I'm recording. So it was looking at married couples, looking at their stress levels and their sexual, sort of what was going on, whether there was sexual dysfunction, and also at their marital satisfaction, and seeing how different pieces of that kind of interact with each other. All right. So do you have any ideas what might be some critiques for it, where it might have been limited?
They're very vague on kind of exactly what kind of stress factors there were. They just said, like, internal and external.
Okay.
There wasn't really, like, a set thing, like, these three types of internal stress were looked at and these three types of external stress were looked at.
Yeah. So they didn't really define one of the variables very well. Stress specifically, they didn't say what was stress, what they were measuring. It was just kind of internal versus external. And so that's a critique because it's not very clear. You don't really know what stresses are important, and you don't really know how they're measuring it. Because stress is, different people think of, so it may have meant different things to each participant, and it may mean different things to different readers. Any other ideas of what things might be limitations, what to check for limitations or problems with this study? So let's start with the population. What kinds of things do we want to check about the participants? We already know they're married. Is there any way that could be a limitation? How long they've been married? It might be very different at 2 years versus 25. What else could be a limitation about married couples? gender. It may be defining married as just men and women, and so male-male or female-female couples might act differently. Age differences, because we could have 50-year-olds who have been married for a year and 20-year-olds who have been married for a year, and those might look very different.
Also, say there's a spouse who's 25 and
Oh, age differences between spouses, because that could definitely influence some things. Culture. Different cultures have different approaches to marriage, different expectations of marriage, and different approaches to sex. So knowing things like the racial backgrounds, knowing where it was done, even within the US, there can be differences in different parts of the country. Also, I don't know if anyone knows this, but occasionally unmarried partners do have sex. And so we don't know if there's something that might be different for people who are having sex, are partnered, but aren't married, when it's just looking at married couples. So other things, you always want to check things like income level, education level. A lot of research gets done on college campuses and tends to have a lot of college-educated people. There may be some differences in people who are college-educated versus not, or people who have middle class and upper class jobs versus lower class. So there's a lot of things to look at in terms of participants. The next thing you would look at is things like what were they measuring, and we already talked about how stress isn't very well defined. Even things like sex, what counts as sex? Is it just intercourse? Is it any sexual contact? And it could be measured very, very specifically, or it might not be. So that's something, you have to think about, how is each piece being defined? What was one of their main findings?
I think it was less stress leads to more sexual activity, which leads to higher satisfaction rates.
Okay, so people who are less stressed are having more sex, and people who are having more sex have higher satisfaction with their marriage partners. And that, I think, at least for me, kind of based on what I see and hear and experience, that seems to make sense. Like, I can believe that pretty easily. Do we think that it's the lower stress that's causing the other things? Or how could we know for sure? We can't from this study, because all we know is that the people, because it could be that if I'm less stressed, I'm having more sex. It also could be if I'm having more sex, that lowers my stress levels. It's hard to say which way it goes. It also could be I'm more satisfied with my partner because we're having more sex, or it could be I'm just happier. And when I'm happier because I'm not as stressed, I'm having more sex and I'm more satisfied. Or if I'm dissatisfied, maybe I'm not so interested in sex. There's a lot of ways that this could go causally. And so you want to check, and you want to be very clear. It's a good thing to write in your limitations whether things are causal. Now, if we had a study where people agreed to have sex a certain amount of times a week, like you told one group to have sex once a week and the other group to have sex 3 times a week, and you measured everybody at the beginning and measured them after 2 months, and the group that's having more sex is now happier, now we can start to say something causally, because we can say you had sex a certain amount of times versus this group, and now your happiness is different. So with a different structure, we could say something causal. But it sounds like this was just asking people what's going on, which is what a lot of your studies are going to be. It's a very common type of research, and it's not bad research, but we can't I can't go out and say, well, if only I was less stressed, I would be happier in my marriage. I can't necessarily say that based on what your study says. Again, any other questions at this point? Anyone else willing to talk through sort of the findings from their study real quick? Okay. Let me just kind of double check the due dates. So your article summary was due right before spring break. I was surprised a lot of people didn't turn one in. And it's not actually a huge part of the final grade because it's 20 points out of 500, but it is an important step to make sure that you're moving toward your paper. It's probably, I deduct 5% for each day it's late, so it's probably getting close to, you could still get a few points for turning it in. Generally, if you turned it in, you got full credit. So if you still want to do it and turn it in, you'll get a few points at least. A few points is better than no points. And it lets me see if you're on your way. If I made a comment and you're not sure what it means, feel free to follow up with me. And then the critical thinking paper is due Friday, April 15th. You don't have to turn in a rough draft for me. I do not review rough drafts over email because what happens is it takes me a really long time to write it all out. And students often don't read or don't understand everything I write anyway. But if you would like to go over it, I will spend a lot of time with you if you just come into my office. So if you bring a rough draft into my office, I'll give you very detailed feedback on it. But there's nothing due. You do, however, have to upload it as either a Word file or a PDF file. This APA formatting does not work well in either Pages or Google Docs. What I suggest, if you use either of those programs regularly, I suggest that you just kind of write the main content of your paper in whatever format you want, and then when you're all done with it and ready to turn it in, go to the library, come to my office, do wherever you want to go to format it, and I can help you if you want, but copy and paste the sections into the rubric, into the template, make the template all pretty, and then upload it in Microsoft Word or a PDF. The other files do not play nice with Blackboard, so it has to be one of those two. So you'll upload it Friday, April 15th by midnight. And again, that's a Friday. Basically, I try to give you as much time as I can to write them and still be able to grade them and get them back to you in a decent time. Any questions about the final paper? Okay. I probably won't schedule time to go over it in class again, but if you have questions, please let me know. It's actually really, really helpful for the class when I can work on specific things. So if you're not sure how to come up with a critique for your article, let me know. You can even email it to me ahead of time, and I can pull it up in class, and we can work as a class to find the critiques. Also, if there's a section that feels too technical or too perfect and you don't know how to put it in your own words, let me know and we can work on it as a class, because it takes some skill to learn how to put things into your own words in a way that makes sense. All right. So let me figure out how to stop my recording. I may have to go.